When I first moved into Maplewood Street, it looked like a dream. The lawns were trimmed to perfection, kids played freely on the sidewalks, and the smell of fresh-cut grass floated in the air. Every neighbor seemed warm, smiling, and welcoming. It felt like one of those quiet little towns where everyone knew each other and life just flowed peacefully. At least that's what I thought. But then there was Gary Holt, the man next door. From the moment I moved in, I could feel his eyes on me. The kind of stare that doesn't come from curiosity, but from judgment. He made it very clear, very quickly, that he didn't like new people in his quiet little world. His words were coated with politeness, but the undertone was sharp enough to cut through steel. It started small. Petty things that were easy to brush off. He'd make offhand comments about how my driveway was too modern for the street. He'd blow leaves onto my lawn after spending hours cleaning his own. Sometimes he'd slam his car door so hard it echoed just as I stepped outside to enjoy a bit of peace. At first, I tried to laugh it off. Maybe he's just grumpy, I told myself. Everyone has bad days, right? I didn't want to assume the worst. I wanted to be the good neighbor, but Gary wasn't having bad days. Gary was the bad day. He lived for it. Within weeks, it became obvious that this wasn't a coincidence or a personality quirk. This was intentional. The man was a professional at making others miserable. He complained to the HOA about my trash bins being an inch too far from the curb. He filed fake noise complaints about my house even though I barely played music. And when that didn't get the reaction he wanted, he went after my reputation. He told neighbors that I was trouble, that I caused problems, that I didn't belong here. And for a while, they believed him. People who used to smile stopped waving. Conversations that used to include me suddenly ended when I walked by. The kids who once played near my yard started avoiding it, glancing nervously in my direction like I was some kind of danger. That's how Gary operated, quietly, manipulatively. He didn't have to yell to make people turn against you. All he needed were whispers. Slowly, the street that had once felt like a dream began to feel like a cage. I started staying indoors more. I told myself it wasn't worth the fight. But every time I looked out the window and saw Gary smirking from his porch, that fire inside me started to grow. I realized that he wasn't just being rude, he was testing me. He wanted me to break, to move, to give up my peace so he could feel powerful again. Maybe he'd done this before to others. Maybe that's why no one dared to confront him. But what Gary didn't know was that I'm not the type to bow down to bullies. Not anymore. I'd dealt with people like him before, the kind who feed on weakness, who mistake kindness for surrender. And this time, I wasn't going to be their victim. He might have started this silent war, but I was going to end it. I just didn't know yet how far things would go, or how much it would change both of our lives forever. Gary was in his late 40s, though he carried himself like someone who'd already given up on life. He had that tired, worn-out look of a man who blamed the world for every wrong turn he'd taken. Retired early, divorced twice, and bitter about everything, that was Gary Holt in a nutshell. He wasn't just miserable. He seemed to take pleasure in spreading that misery to everyone around him. He loved control. He loved rules. And most of all, he loved catching people breaking them. Maplewood Street was his little kingdom, and he ruled it with pettiness instead of power. He'd stand outside for hours, arms crossed, pretending to water his plants while actually keeping tabs on everyone. If you trimmed your hedge unevenly, he'd stroll over with a fake smile and say, "Need some help with that? Looks a little rough on the edges." If your mail piled up for a few days, he'd whisper to another neighbor, "Poor thing's too lazy to check the box." He turned harmless details into neighborhood drama, the kind of man who could twist silence into scandal. Everyone on Maplewood knew his game, but they tolerated him, not because they liked him, but because arguing with Gary was like arguing with a storm, loud, relentless, and impossible to win. He'd twist your words, mock your patience, and walk away like the hero of his own story. So, most people just smiled politely and ignored him. But I wasn't most people. One sunny afternoon, I came home from running errands and saw Gary standing at the edge of my driveway. He wasn't even pretending to be casual. He was taking photos of my car. His phone clicked repeatedly and he didn't even look guilty when I stepped out. Problem? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He turned to me with that sharp, sarcastic smile that made my stomach tighten. Just documenting, he said calmly. Your car's been parked too close to the fire hydrant. HOA rules, you know. Then he raised his phone like a weapon, snapped one more picture, and walked off, slow, smug, and satisfied. I stood there, jaw tight, watching him disappear into his house. That moment told me everything I needed to know about Gary Holt. He didn't just follow the rules, he weaponized them. He didn't want peace. He wanted power. It wasn't enough for him to be right. He needed others to feel wrong. He thrived on irritation, on pushing people to their limits just to watch them lose control. It wasn't about the hydrant or the trash bins or the hedges. It was about dominance. And standing there, I realized something important. This wasn't just a grumpy man with too much time on his hands. This was someone who enjoyed making others miserable. He needed chaos the way normal people needed air, but I wasn't going to give him what he wanted. He wanted a reaction, a shouting match, a moment where I'd lose my calm and give him the satisfaction of being right. I refused. So I took a deep breath, unclenched my fists, and walked back inside. I told myself, not today, Gary. Let him think he'd won that round. Because while he played his small, bitter games, I was already learning exactly who I was dealing with. And soon, very soon, he'd learn that I wasn't someone he could push around forever. For now, though, I'd stay calm and let him dig his own hole, one smug little move at a time. Weeks went by, and Gary's little pranks stopped feeling like accidents and started feeling like attacks. At first, it was the small stuff, trash can positioning, a sour comment here and there. But then his cruelty sharpened into something personal. One morning, I walked outside to find my garden brown and brittle, the soil crusted with something chemical. My hands froze over the bed where my mother's favorite flowers had been blooming. I had planted those blooms the spring after she died. They were soft, stubborn colors that made the yard feel like home. That afternoon, they looked like they'd been scorched. I checked for footprints, for a stray sprinkler malfunction, anything that might explain it. There was nothing, except a faint chemical smell and the slow, terrible realization that this was no accident. He had sprayed something along the edge of my garden when I wasn't home. When I knocked on his door that night, he stood on his porch with a beer in one hand and a smirk on his face, as if he'd been expecting me. He didn't even try to hide it. Maybe your plants weren't meant for this soil, he said, like it was a joke and I was missing the punchline. That line sat on my tongue like a stone. You don't plant anything tender and not expect to protect it, and you don't watch someone's grief and snuff it out for sport. The thing about people like Gary is how casual they can be with cruelty. He'd made a habit of small torments until smallness didn't matter to him anymore. It becomes a pattern. Push, watch, smile when the person flinches. That night, the smile on his face looked like victory. After that, the harassment escalated. He took to nights, late, stubborn, deliberate nights, when most of the street slept. The mower would roar to life after midnight, its engine a hungry beast chewing through the quiet. Sometimes it was a radio turned too loud, blasting songs in a loop until the windows rattled. Other times he'd fire up that old truck of his and peel out of the driveway, revving the engine in a way that said, "I can bother you and there's nothing you can do." Sleep became a fragile thing I couldn't afford. I would lie awake, listening for the engine, listening for the familiar clack of his boots on the porch steps, waiting for the moment when some new nuisance would begin. My days blurred into nights and back again, stitched together by exhaustion. I tried to carry on, work, dishes, the simple rituals that used to steady me, but rage settled into the background like a second shadow. It was a strange mixture of helplessness and fury. Helpless because the rules seemed to bend for him, fury because he'd targeted things that mattered to me. The final straw came wrapped in bureaucracy. One afternoon, a uniformed animal control officer showed up at my door, polite and official, holding a clipboard. There had been a complaint. My dog, they said, had been barking nonstop. The officer warned me that another complaint could result in fines or worse, a visit that might change my pet's status. My dog, Milo, tilted his head at the officer and wagged, confused, like he didn't understand why trouble was knocking. Milo had always been gentle. He liked naps and tennis balls and curling up at my feet. He wasn't a loud dog. He wasn't a nuisance. He was my family. When the officer left, I sat on the stoop and felt something shift inside me. Gary had weaponized everything I loved. He'd clipped the wings off flowers I'd planted for my mother. He'd stolen my nights. He'd used official channels to turn my dog into a problem. It was no longer about petty neighborhood rules or territorial nagging. That was obvious now. It was about control, humiliation, about making me feel isolated and unstable, like everyone was watching me through his lens. I let the anger burn, but I didn't let it scorch me into rash action. For months I'd tried to be the reasonable neighbor, the one who smiled and waved and ignored the small provocations. That patience had been mistaken for weakness. So I changed the shape of my response. Instead of meeting his chaos with open confrontation, I began to plan, quietly, deliberately. I started to pay attention to his moves, to mark the times and the patterns, to collect the small truths that would prove his lies. The line between patience and passivity is thin. I had crossed it for too long. Now I decided I'd take back what he had taken, not with anger that matched his, but with something colder and truer: purpose. The morning it happened, the air felt wrong before I even stepped outside. I remember hearing a low crack when I opened the door, the kind of sound wood makes when it's been splintered apart. My stomach tightened as I followed the noise to the side of my yard, and that's when I saw it. My fence. Broken clean through. Panels cracked, hinges twisted, and deep tire marks carving ugly scars across my grass. Whoever did it hadn't just brushed against it. They'd plowed right through. I didn't need a detective to guess who it was. The tracks were narrow, uneven, exactly what Gary's old ATV would leave. He rode that thing like it was a badge of power, roaring down the street every weekend just to remind everyone he could. But this time, he'd crossed a line. I called the police, my voice shaking with more anger than fear. 2 officers arrived within 20 minutes, walking the scene like it was a casual Sunday stroll. They jotted notes, asked a few half-hearted questions, and finally looked at me with a kind of bored sympathy. "Unless you have proof," one of them said, "there's not much we can do." Could have been a delivery truck, maybe kids fooling around. I wanted to scream. Proof? What more proof did they need than the tire tracks that led straight to his side of the yard? But I bit my tongue because, at that very moment, I noticed something that made my anger burn colder. Gary. He was standing just a few yards away, watering his plants like a man without a care in the world. The green hose snaked lazily around his boots as he stared in my direction. He didn't say a word, didn't need to. That smirk said everything. He knew I couldn't touch him. He knew the system would shrug like it always did. He'd built his reputation as the harmless neighborhood crank. The guy who just loved the rules. No one saw the monster behind the mask. When the officers finally left, I stood in my yard staring at the wreckage. My fence lay twisted like a broken ribcage, and something inside me snapped with it. For months I'd been reacting, trying to fix what he broke, trying to defend myself, trying to reason with chaos. But Gary thrived on reaction. Every time I pushed back, he grinned wider. Every time I stayed quiet, he pushed further. It was a game to him, and I'd been playing by his rules. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, sleep nowhere near me. I thought about my mother's flowers, about Milo, about the neighbors who'd started to avoid me because of his lies. My chest felt heavy with the weight of all those little moments he'd stolen. And then, somewhere in the middle of that sleepless night, the weight shifted. I stopped feeling helpless. I stopped feeling scared. A calm, deliberate thought formed in my mind. It's time to stop reacting and start orchestrating. From that night on, the balance changed. I began to watch him, just like he'd watched me. Not obsessively, not out of spite, strategically. Every morning, I'd jot notes on a small pad I kept by the window. When he left, When he came home, what time his lights went out, when he met visitors, even what he carried in and out of his truck. I became invisible, patient, calculating. Days turned into weeks, and slowly his patterns started to emerge. I learned that Gary wasn't as cautious as he pretended to be. He thought no one saw him sneaking out late at night. He thought no one noticed the boxes he loaded into his garage after dark, or the phone calls he took outside in a hushed tone, pacing like a man guarding secrets. At first, I thought it was just another one of his weird hobbies, maybe hoarding or collecting junk. But the more I watched, the clearer it became. Gary Holt, the self-proclaimed enforcer of neighborhood rules, was living a double life. And that's when I realized the man who spent his days tormenting others was hiding something far worse behind his perfect lawn and painted smile. For the first time in months, I felt a strange sense of control. He thought he was the hunter. But what he didn't know was that the tables had just turned, and this time I wasn't the one being watched. It was close to midnight when I saw the glow of headlights flicker through my curtains. At first I thought it was just someone driving by, but the light lingered, slow, deliberate. I peeked through the blinds, careful not to be seen, and there he was. Gary Holt. The man who made my life miserable for months was in his driveway, dressed in dark clothes, loading boxes into the back of his truck. The street was quiet. No other lights were on. He moved quickly, almost professionally. Lift, check, cover, repeat. There was a rhythm to it, like someone who'd done it before. I watched for a moment, my mind racing. What could he possibly be doing at that hour? Curiosity won over caution, so I grabbed my keys and slipped into my car, staying far enough behind his truck to keep my headlights off. He drove through the empty streets, past the main road until he turned down an unfinished lane near the new construction site. The place had been under development for months. New houses, piles of lumber, tools, and equipment left behind each night. I parked a block away, just enough to see without being seen. Gary met a man there, tall, wearing a hoodie, and they talked in the shadows. I couldn't hear the words, but the movement told the story. Gary opened the tailgate, showed the boxes. The man handed him a thick envelope. Cash, no doubt about it. They nodded at each other, quick and practiced, and then Gary drove off like nothing happened. That was the moment it all clicked. The strange late-night trips, the boxes, the calls outside. Gary wasn't just a bored bully. He was running a small-time theft operation right under everyone's nose. He was stealing building materials from the site and selling them for quick cash. And the best part? He did it all while bragging to the HOA about being Mr. Perfect Citizen. The guy who reported everyone else for rule violations was, in truth, the biggest rule breaker on the block. I remember smiling for the first time in months. Not out of joy, but out of something sharper, satisfaction. Because now, the game had changed. The bully who made me feel powerless had just handed me the one thing I needed most: leverage. The next morning, I began setting my plan in motion. I went out and bought a small camera, one of those motion-activated ones people use for wildlife. I set it up behind a flower pot near my front window, angled perfectly toward his driveway. It blended in so well you wouldn't notice it unless you were looking for it. And Gary? He never suspected a thing. Over the next several days, I gathered footage. Hours of it. Gary in his driveway at odd hours, carrying boxes from his garage to his truck. Sometimes he'd look around nervously, scanning the street before loading up. Other times he'd be scribbling on papers. Receipts, maybe? I zoomed in once, and my stomach twisted when I saw what it was. Forms from the HOA, with signatures that clearly weren't his. He was forging documents, probably to cover his tracks or approve his fake deliveries. Every new clip made the picture clearer. Gary Holt, the self-proclaimed rule enforcer of Maplewood, was nothing more than a liar, a thief, and a fraud. The man who used HOA rules as weapons had built his little kingdom on deceit. For days, I said nothing. I went about my routine like usual. Waved when he looked my way. Let him think I was still that quiet neighbor he could push around. But inside, I was waiting for the right moment to strike. It wasn't about petty revenge anymore. I didn't want to just get even. That would make me like him. What I wanted was truth, undeniable, unshakable truth, to come crashing down on him the way he'd crashed through my peace. This time, I wasn't the one being watched. This time, I was the one keeping score. And as I reviewed the footage on my laptop late one night, frame by frame, watching Gary expose himself in his own driveway, I whispered to myself the words that kept me going. It's not revenge anymore. It's justice in progress. It was strange how easy it was to turn the tables once I stopped reacting and started thinking. I didn't want to just expose Gary. I wanted him to feel it. The same suffocating sense of being watched, whispered about, and powerless to stop it. He had built his world on control, and my plan was simple. Take that control away piece by piece until he crumbled under the same pressure he'd forced on everyone else. I started small, quiet, harmless conversations that seemed accidental. When I saw Mrs. Jensen walking her dog, I sighed just loud enough for her to hear. Oh, I thought Gary mentioned he was selling things from the HOA shed. Maybe I misunderstood. Her eyes widened, and I could practically see the gears turning. A few days later, I chatted with the couple across the street while taking out the trash. Strange, I said casually. I saw Gary out late again. Must be helping with those HOA supplies or something. That's all it took. One sentence at a time, the seeds were planted. In a neighborhood where gossip moved faster than mail, I didn't have to push hard. Within a week, the whispers had spread through Maplewood like smoke through a dry forest. Suddenly, the same people who once nodded politely at Gary now avoided eye contact. They watched him from behind curtains, slowed their conversations when he walked by, and stopped waving. It was beautiful, in a poetic kind of way, watching the guardian of the neighborhood realize he was now the subject of everyone's quiet suspicion. He tried to fight it, of course. Gary's smile got tighter, his tone sharper. He began overcompensating, greeting people louder, forcing friendly jokes, trying to prove he wasn't what they were beginning to believe. But that's the thing about paranoia. Once it takes root, it grows fast. And then came the final touch, the part I'd been waiting for. Early one morning, before sunrise, I walked down to the HOA president's mailbox and slipped in a plain brown envelope. Inside was a single USB drive and a typed note. Your trusted neighbor, Gary Holt, has been stealing from you all. Watch before you defend him. No name, no return address, no fingerprints. Just truth, neatly packaged. I remember walking back home as the first light broke through the trees, calm and steady, my breath visible in the cold air. It wasn't triumph I felt, not yet. It was anticipation, the quiet before the storm. By the afternoon, everything started unraveling. I saw the HOA president pacing outside Gary's house, holding the USB in his hand, his face pale and furious. Word spread fast, faster than before. By evening, half the neighborhood knew, and by the next day, Gary's driveway was empty. He didn't show up to the HOA meeting. His precious, perfect reputation was cracking open, and for once, he couldn't control the narrative. I watched from my window, the same way he used to watch me. Only now the roles were reversed. He was the one shrinking under the gaze of others, the one being judged, doubted, and isolated. And that's when it hit me. Revenge doesn't always need noise or chaos. Sometimes the most devastating blow is delivered in silence, cold, clean, and perfect. 2 days later, Maplewood Street looked nothing like the peaceful neighborhood it used to be. Flashing red and blue lights painted the manicured lawns. Curtains fluttered as people peeked through their windows. Whispers rippled through the crowd, gathering at the edge of the cul-de-sac. 3 police cars were parked right in front of Gary's perfect little house. And there he was, standing on his porch, shouting, flailing his arms, trying to talk his way out of the mess he'd built. I stood quietly behind my blinds, watching it all unfold. "Sir, step back," one officer warned, his voice steady but firm. Gary's face was beet red, sweat dripping down his temples. "This is ridiculous," he barked. "I didn't do anything wrong. I helped this neighborhood." But no amount of yelling could change what they were about to find. The officers opened his garage, and for a long, heavy moment, everything went silent. Then came the words that ended it all. "We've got something here." One by one, they carried out boxes, labeled, sealed, some even tagged with company names from the nearby construction site. Stacks of receipts, envelopes of cash, and fake HOA documents followed. It was all there. Everything I'd seen through my window, now out in the open for everyone to witness. The crowd grew thicker. Neighbors who once believed Gary's lies were now whispering to each other, eyes wide in disbelief. The same people who once avoided me now stood frozen, watching their model citizen unravel. And then Gary looked up. Our eyes met across the fence, the same fence he'd driven through just weeks ago. But this time there was no smirk, no smug satisfaction, no twisted sense of power, just shock, raw, hollow disbelief. It was over. They cuffed him right there on his porch. The sound of the metal clicking around his wrists was quiet but final, like the last line of a long, bitter story. As they led him to the car, a few neighbors turned toward me. Some looked guilty, others just stunned. Mrs. Jensen, the one who used to cross the street to avoid me, muttered, "You were right about him." I didn't respond. I didn't need to, because for the first time in months, the air around my house felt still, peaceful. No more fake smiles across the fence. No more revving engines at midnight. No more shouting or scheming or whispers in the dark. Just silence, soft, calm, real. And standing there in that silence, I realized something. Sometimes justice doesn't roar. Sometimes it whispers, after the noise is finally gone. A few weeks after the arrest, I found an envelope tucked under the slot in my mailbox. The paper was cheap and the handwriting shaky. A man used to anger more than letters. Inside was a single folded page. Gary had scribbled from county jail. "You think you won, but this neighborhood was mine long before you came. Enjoy your fake peace. It won't last." I read it once, then again, and then I laughed. It was the kind of laugh that comes out of a place of relief more than humor. A small, incredulous thing that felt like air returning to my lungs. He was still trying to claim power from behind bars, still trying to scare me with threats that came out thin on paper. It felt ridiculous. He wasn't powerful anymore. He was paper thin. What I didn't expect was how quickly the truth would continue to unravel. The HOA started digging deeper after the raid, partly because the president couldn't ignore the evidence, partly because people finally stopped being afraid of what Gary might do if they looked too closely. What they found wasn't small. Fake expense claims, missing community funds that had been siphoned away in tiny, clever ways, signed checks that didn't match receipts. It seemed he'd built himself a secret repository of other people's trust and emptied it one careful notch at a time. Each new discovery made the neighborhood hold its breath and then exhale in a different way. The same people who had once nodded and smiled at Gary now stood in their driveways, eyes wide, whispering about the meetings he'd chaired and the money he'd moved. It was like watching a mural peel away to reveal graffiti beneath. The perfect man, exposed as the fraud he really was. And the unexpected part? The apologies. They came slow at first. A quiet, "I'm sorry," from Mrs. Jensen as she handed my mail back. A hesitant conversation across the fence where neighbors admitted they'd been afraid to look. Those apologies weren't gifts I needed, but they felt like the last loose threads being tied off. The street shifted. People began to speak again, to share small stories, to stop pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. Then, in a gesture that made my stomach flip with irony, the HOA asked if I'd consider taking Gary's seat. "We need someone who cares about this place," the president said, his voice awkward and earnest. There was a moment, a tiny, tempting moment, where I pictured myself sitting at the meetings, wielding the same authority Gary had misused. But I didn't want his chair. I didn't want the responsibility that came with the role he'd corrupted. My goal had never been to step into his kingdom. It was to dismantle it, so I declined. I said thank you politely and walked away. Walking home felt lighter than it had in months. The nuisance that had haunted my days was finally gone, and the quiet that remained wasn't fragile anymore. It felt earned. Sitting on my porch that evening, I watched kids play in the street and neighbors talk over hedges. The constant tension that had shadowed every step was gone, replaced by something ordinary and honest. My revenge hadn't been dramatic or loud. I hadn't burned bridges or crashed his life with fury. I had exposed the truth, let it spread, and watched the structures he'd built on fear collapse under their own weight. In the end, that was the twist he never saw coming. He thought he'd taken everything that mattered, but by revealing him, we reclaimed more than I ever imagined. Trust, peace, a neighborhood that could finally laugh again without glancing over its shoulder. Looking back, I realize now just how much power fear holds, how it can shape days, weigh on your shoulders, and make every small interaction feel like a battle. People like Gary feed on that fear. They thrive when others shrink, when silence becomes the armor that protects them. For months, I let his presence dictate my life. His pranks, his lies, his constant pressure had stolen pieces of my peace, my sleep, even the simple joy of tending to my garden. I let him take more than I should have. But then I learned something crucial. The moment you choose to act, with calm and intelligence and patience, fear loses its grip. You don't have to yell, you don't have to lash out, and you don't have to stoop to the level of someone who thrives on cruelty. Sometimes the strongest actions are the quiet ones, the deliberate ones that make the truth undeniable. Revenge doesn't always need fire or fury. It doesn't require chaos or destruction. Sometimes it's about observation, about preparation, about letting someone's own actions speak louder than words ever could. The satisfaction comes not from humiliating them, but from reclaiming what they tried to take. Your peace, your dignity, your voice. Now, when I sit on my porch and watch the street, listening to the soft rustle of leaves and the laughter of children playing, I smile. That quiet breeze, the calm that fills the air, feels sweeter than any moment of confrontation ever could. I remember Gary Holt, the man who thought he could control me, who thought he could bend my life to his will. And I realized the most ironic, satisfying truth. He didn't break me at all. Instead, he taught me how to stand firm without sinking low. How to fight back with strategy, patience, and grace. How to let the world witness the truth, and in doing so, restore balance without ever losing yourself. And that was the most shocking surprise of all.